Okay, I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The antagonization of men actively shifts focus away from the true root problem of patriarchy, which is the very structures that have been systematically entrenched in people's life. In so far as we can prove to you three things, is that number one, why is it the portrayal of men as victims of patriarchy aligns with the principle of feminism itself? And then number two, that this creates actual buy-in, which leads to number three, actual progress for the feminism movement within this debate. But first, a few pieces of framing. We think that the patriarchy is a structure that has been set up by men in power, and that it is not true that the patriarchy is something that men themselves have created. Because we think that historically, these kind of structures have been set up by the elite, by the rich, to serve their interests. Meaning this was never a war waged against gender, rather a byproduct of capitalism to allow the rich to thrive. We think that in status quo, in so many structures have caused men to be victims of the particular structures in few ways. Number one, how it has perpetuated the idea of gender roles, sort of like men are constrained and be restricted in the sense of identity they need to portray, meaning like men need to be the breadwinners of a family, men need to be the more dominant one in a relationship, things like that. Or number two, I'll take one later. Or number two, the idea of toxic masculinity, in which men experience a lot of shame when it comes to expressing the vulnerability of emotions. There's no sort of meaningful discourse when it comes to explaining men's emotions and things like that. Also, number three, this also looks like the idea that men need to be men, that need to be toughened up. This looks like male sexual assault victims that cannot speak up because of the fact that they need to toughen up. They cannot allow to have their experiences to be something that to be shared and things like that. But before I move on with the principle of feminism, I'll take one of your eyes.
Yeah, so men have it harder than women in any aspect in life.
What the fuck? Like, I don't think this debate is about the really binary sense of who suffers more. We think that insofar as men are still multifaceted beings at the end of the day, and that a lot of problems that go through are not because of the direct cause of the binary gender role that has been exerted, that men at the end of the day are still humans, they still go through things and suffering, like trauma or rape, they still go through suffering because of things like that. We don't see why their POI stands. Next, moving on to the principle of feminism. We think the principle of feminism is always about pro-women and never about anti-men. This looks like feminism is something that's for women and things like that. But however, the perception of status quo, if you portray men as beneficiaries of movement, this means that you now contravene the idea that feminism is now anti-men. But the thing is, feminism has always been about equal gender. This looks like advocating for equal wages, advocating for equal access to education and things like that. This means that feminism has always about equality, means about men and women, means you are never about anti-men. Insofar as we tell you that this principally aligns with the fact that when you portray men as victims, this aligns with the fact that it's about gender equality, we think that the principle stands. Next, the problem with status quo. The point in which where you portray men as beneficiaries of this kind of structure, there's an active villainization of men. This looks like antagonizing men. This looks like antagonizing men and constantly shifting the focus of the problems of a lot of the byproduct of these structures towards men. This looks like, oh, why is it that I get unequal pay? It's because of men. Why is it that women are constantly out there getting raped? It's because of men and things like that. We think it causes a greater divide and polarization, which will be explained more later further in my speech. Next, how does the shift in portrayal when it comes to portraying victims looks like versus portraying them as beneficiaries? We think, no, I'll take on later. But first, we think that the shift in method in portrayal looks like the change in vocabulary in terms of how you want to buy in people, in terms of how you want to tell other people and things like that. The shift in vocabulary looks like an example in a discourse of male suicide in status quo, where males are often portrayed as beneficiaries of the structure. The discourse is likely to look like, oh, male suicide rates higher. The response that's coming from this kind of discourse is likely to be like, number one, but women suffer too. Or the number one, but guys are the one that set the system up, so you have to deal with it. Because of these kinds of things, there's an active displacement of males who are actually the victims of the very structures that have been set up. Versus on outside, if we have to shift the problem towards the structures, this is where you don't allow men who never had the power to control themselves to begin with to be able to then realize that they are also part of the victims of this particular structure. But also number two, we think that the shift in method in portrayal also looks like more buy-in from men. It comes in twofold. Number one, now you empower men more, and also number two, you empower more people within the particular movement, both men and women. Number one, how you empower men more? Because now men who originally thought that the feminist movement, I'll take on later at 5, that the feminism movement is always about just women, now realize that they can be part of movement itself. This is when they realize that gender equality can be something they can be part of. But number two, how it empowers the people within, both men and women, is the point in which there is an intra-solidarity within the movement itself, because now both men and women understand that they're fighting the same war, they're fighting the same entity, they're fighting the same structure. This is when you also get more consolidation. This is when you get more of a solidarity and things like that. This means there's much more of a political will and more social capital. The point in which you shift your focus towards this kind of structures, there's more social capital and more political will to try to actually take down these structures. This will have more advocacies for legislative changes, for more policy changes to try to change, take down these structures to begin with. There's more attack to these structures rather than attack on individuals such as men. Thirdly, in the absence of the portrayal, we think that this means that the patriarchal structure is something that men will only fall back on. But before I move on, I'll take one more POI.
Like, let's get out of the debate land. What does a man actually being a victim to the patriarchal structure look like in the world?
If a man is a victim of patriarchal structure, patriarchal tells you that man is supposed to be strong, man is supposed to be someone that you shouldn't talk out because men should be subjugated to gender roles. We then at this point in things like that, it means that things like rape culture, men also suffer. I talked about that in the first minute of speech. I don't know why you didn't listen to it. But in absence of the portrayal, we think that this structure is something that only serves as a safety net for men to fall back on. This is true because this structure is something that's proximate and familiar and intuitive for men. The point in which you continuously tell men, but you are the very beneficiaries of the structures that have been set up. You are the ones that have caused this problem to perpetuate. This is a attack on men themselves. This causes men to directly lash out towards women. This causes men to feel justified in a lash out towards women themselves. We think that the impacts are threefold. Number one, polarization. The point in which a man will attack, this causes a bigger divide between the genders and things like that. Also, number two, this is also an active displacement of status quo men who have been the victims of the very structures that have been set up. We think this is bad because men should have the liberty to be expressed, to be expressed beyond the particular gender roles that have been constrained because of the structure that have been set up. Also, number three, you are now reinforcing the patriarchal structures, the point in which you allow more men to stray away from the feminism movement, which has been supposed to be about gender equality. We think the point in which that you stray away the men from the patriarchy and things itself, and men are continually feeling attacked for just because for something that can never be controlled to begin with. They never chose to be men to begin with. They were never the ones to set up those structures to begin with. This is the point in which you increase more shame for victims who are being for shame for rape victims, rape male victims who don't want to come out and talk about because the point of view you keep continuing to tell them, but it's your fault, it's because of men and things like that. Also, number two, this looks like there's lesser help for these kind of men who want to speak out. Meaning, at the end of the day, if we tell you that we prove to you there's more unified sense of a solidarity between men and women under a continuous wage war against patriarchy during this debate.
Thank you, Prime Minister. I'm back to your order.
Relies on misogynistic and terrible men. The only question the panel needs to ask themselves is, are all men misogynistic and terrible? If that is true, then IIU wins. But insofar as most men aren't bad people, and telling them that they are and they benefit and they structurally oppress women forces them into the very narratives in which you claim are terrible. It's the point which IIU cannot win this debate because you are then whitewashing and telling the entire male population that is something you benefited from, therefore pay reparations for something you never consented to. This is a narrative which pushes individuals into the worst kinds of structures. It hampers the movement and it prevents actual progress, which earnestly proves to you they got no response from the side of opposition. A couple of things in framing before I go on to auxiliary responses. First, let's talk about the origins of patriarchy. They claim it's imperialist, set by capitalists. Yeah, sure, we agreed to all that in like the first minute. The question therefore is, why is it that the current modern day men that are necessarily culpable or caused these forms of patriarchy to exist? Because it was clear from MNUDC that this isn't the case. Most modern day men are not complicit or not resultant of the creation or the establishment of patriarchy. In fact, we go the complete opposite direction. That most men are forced into these narratives without their consent, because individuals have to be born into a toxic male-dominated narrative, which is their corporate structures are male-dominated, their families are male-dominated, their religious industries are male-dominated, and they have no opt-out mechanism for it because society pushes you in that mechanism. We think the feminist movement as a countervailing force to this is the only thing that provides sovereignty for these countries, which is the individuals that never consented into a harmful narrative that shackled them and changed them to an identity that they never wanted, cannot be held culpable for something that they never chose, which is an inherent problem in IU's case, which they don't fail to understand the metrics in which this debate works. Secondly, on strategic mistakes, they want to argue that they don't villainize men and therefore everything is sunshine and rainbows because necessarily men already love the feminist movement to begin. Number one, if they don't villainize men, I'm unclear their path to change. I don't think it is true or ingenuous for you to argue that the feminist movement is already great, already accepted, and therefore has not changed. Insofar as the feminist movement still exists, still protests, and still fight for legislative change, I'm unable to buy that analysis. But secondly, they want to claim that men are allies, but then argue that all men are necessarily bad and need to be talked about in this manner. Therefore, I am unclear as to whether men are actually good or men are going to be misogynist in order to hijack this material. Insofar as their characterization of men flip-flops into where it's convenient, I don't think they can take this claim. Two auxiliary responses. Number one, the POI came up. Do men suffer more? Guys, suffering isn't a competition. I'm unclear why IU wants to win suffering. Insofar as men suffer as much or equally at the point in which toxic narratives change them to things that they never wanted. I could want to be a house husband, but like narratives tell me I have to go out and work and go to the gym. But necessarily, suicide rates are all-time high. We think this forced entrapment means that suffering is almost equitable. Maybe it's different forms of suffering, but we don't think anyone wins suffering in terms of the movement. But number two, they want to argue that they get better forms of intersectionality. I'm unclear why this is exclusive, guys. Why does telling men that they are fine mean that you cannot get representation for different types of women? I think the representation still exists on both sides of the house. That's charitable to this. Two things there. Number one, don't hate the player, hate the game. I'm unclear why that this is not possible. Because IU posits that it is impossible to challenge the structures of these men without challenging the men themselves. Insofar as UNC is going through multiple reasons why, number one, men aren't complicit within the creation of the structures. Number two, men are forced in without an opt-out to these structures. And number three, that these structures can be challenged absent of the people within them. We think these are multiple roadmaps we've already proved to you why structures on our side can be countered without having to actively attack the people which rely on these structures. Three things here under this issue. I think that when the dice is loaded, number one, the structures are a forced opt-in, at the point in which men cannot consent to being in these structures. When society tells you that you need to be macho, you need to be strong, it's when all of UNC's harm materializes. When men cannot opt out of toxic masculinity, when men cannot opt out of the ability to be silent at the point of rape because they are scared to show emotion. That is when individuals cannot feasibly interact with anything beyond that because they are forced into a narrative that pushes them to behave in a certain way. Why does this narrative then, what does the side opposition then force men to worse from? There's a point in which you say that you are beneficial towards this, that you benefited, therefore you need to pay reparations, you need to compensate for the feminist movement. We think this necessarily pushes men into the structure that you claim are the worst. Because at the point in which the feminist movement actively attacks them, whether is it demonization or just simply telling you that you benefited, therefore you are bad, it attacks the very emotional state or the very fundamentals of being a man itself, which pushes you into the worst degrees of structural harms. It means that you're more likely to buy into the only structure that provides you a sense of self-affirmation. Because when everyone else is attacking you for being who you are and not choosing the gender in which you are born, there's a point in which the men therefore opt into the worst structures, where you see people opt into toxic masculinity, opt into toxic traits that attack women. These are the points in time in which structures then manifest in the worst ways possible. Why is the comparative better? I'll just tell you three reasons that just went unresponded. Number one, you get more buy-in because you're better able to opt into these structures because men are not told they are trash, men are not told they are bad. It means opting becomes fundamentally better on outside of us. But number two, you get less polarization. When the feminist movement doesn't participate in otherization, and men don't have to use that as a countervailing mechanism or defense mechanism or to push feminists away. So you get less polarization and better discourse about things in open spaces. When the first leading question of a feminist isn't that all men are trash, explain yourself, this is where we get better forms of engagement into movements. But number three, there are better pathways to change. I'll take you before I explain. There are clearer pathways to change on outside of because when you get better buy-in, it immediately translates to better shift of Overton window and political will to get proper change legislation. This is a comparative because maybe on the other side you get unified change in government and force, but unclear why this is sustainable or strategic for a movement that has very limited resources to begin with. Go here. Okay, if on your side you can say men are allies, that means you can distinguish between misogynistic elite and non-misogynistic. If that is true on outside the house, that means you can call out misogynistic elite for hijacking narratives like this. Within the misogynistic elite is a minority of the case. If you are able to distinguish, I don't see why it's charitable to say that we can't as well. Next, on forms of protection. I think the kinds of discourse are very important in this case where we get better levels of discourse. Why this protects both men and both the feminist movement internally and externally? The reason why it protects them externally is for all the reasons I said before, but how men are less likely to attack the movement as a defense mechanism, how have better engagement. But it's also internalized movements within the feminist movement, how promote for better forms of engagement within men, perception against men, and better forms of call-outs. Because if you agree that not all men are bad, and therefore they are victims themselves, misogynists who try to hijack narratives becomes clear as day, because it's a misappropriation and a misconstruction of a narrative that you are very clear about as both men and women opting into feminist movements, which is why you get better forms of call-out. On the other side of the house, you allow misogynists to hijack a narrative that the feminist women are attacking us, therefore galvanizing men against them. It means the worst kinds of house materialize on the other side of the house. Only on the side of government you get actual material change for a movement that requires solvency so bad, so proud to propose.
Right? I wish that the government side does not talk too loud while I speak. Okay, so there's that system. And then, but you can talk, it's okay, but don't too loud. And also, I'll take a few ahead. Okay, thank you. Okay, I'll start my speech. Okay. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Government side is making feminism the only thing women have, a man thing, right? Several call out before I move on to issues. First call out is the misidentification of problem and case coming from government side. Understand that their case is to paint men as also the victim of patriarchy, not only women. 5 reasons why this is bad, right? Oh, sorry, I have 4. 1 is it loses the principle and meaning of feminism in the first place. Understand that NT lie when they tell you that feminism fight for equality. That is simply not true. Feminism is built to fight for women and always will and forever will be. Fight for women against the structure that is discriminative towards women. But second is loss of focus on this feminism movement, because they claim that NT claim that men will now join feminism and fight for in this feminism movement in order to fight these structural barriers, right? But I understand this makes the feminism movement lose focus because now they have 2 individuals they have to fight for. But actually, the competition inside the movement as well. Now men and women have to fight against each other, because men also feel like this structure is bothering us. Women also feel like this structure on advice that this woman is also bothering us, right? But also last reason is that there is no clear enemy to fight, because now men and women are both fighting against who? Like man is fighting against men, woman is fighting against men. Yeah, right. So the burden ought to be why putting men as victims will help exclusively the feminist movement, right? Because I understand this is detrimental to their case, as this debate is supposed to help the feminist movement, which is clearly mentioned in this house with the feminist movement, blah, blah, blah. Second call out, the minuscule of the problem. Understand that their focus is they focus on the challenges faced by men. When asked, for example, NT mentioned having to go to the gym, they can't cry, they can't speak out after being sexually assaulted, and they have toxic masculinity. Very funny. 3 responses to it. First response is how minuscule this problem is comparing to what women is facing. What are women facing? Women are trigger warning, raped, killed, seen as weak, catcalled, can't get hired, face can't get go to the interview, can't get hired, blah, blah, blah. The conclusion is you can't frame that whatever struggle man is following man is facing is same as what female is facing, right? Because you're putting them on the same foot. Understand that only the woman is the victim and man is the beneficiary of patriarchy, which is the narrative in status quo that what we are fighting for as well. Second response then is that there are already movements, or this is me mitigating lah. There's already movements on progress to help men. This looks like therapies or TikTok videos that are already like fighting for men, having men speak out, right? That's why I can comfortably say that, oh, I've been sexually assaulted by anyone, right? But third, that even if men cannot cry, we don't care. We don't care that men cannot cry, men cannot voice out. It's okay. Because comparing to all of the women's struggles that women are facing, we say that we need these narratives to stay in status quo. Understand it's never equal. The conclusion is that this narrative attacks women and government cannot take it to be a man thing, right? The conclusion is the risk of our harm is not worth the benefit of helping simple problems that men are facing. Sure, you have toxic masculinity, but you are the CEO of freaking Apple. You are living in Beverly Hills because you have more opportunities in job interviews. Okay, moving on to my third call out, which is a very simple thing. Sorry. What last thing that Wesley mentioned in his speech on recognizing misogyny. Understand that there is an assumption that we can call out misogyny when it is an internalized thing. Understand that Atifa told you why we cannot call them out. It's hard, and you are taking away the platform for women to voice out. One issue before I move on to my extension: does men actually want to opt out of patriarchy? Because this is what Wesley argued. Understand that firstly, the problem is that this is very assumptive. Wesley asserted that men wanted to opt out without any structural reason, but I'll tell you why this is not true. Understand that patriarchy already benefits men in the first place. The scale of benefits against the negative of cannot cry is like there's more reasons why men would want to stay in this patriarchal structure, because they get the jobs that they go to interview with. They get to be in parliament. They get more quota. Therefore, it's less likely that these men want to opt to leave these patriarchal structures and fight against this structure in the first place. First extension then why men being seen as beneficiaries are more likely to garner buy-in in two prongs. One among men and second among women. Firstly, among men, the framing is that the fact that there is a lot of men in power, now we need to get these men on board with the feminist movement. Understand our distinction is that we don't want men to be feminist movement to fight for themselves. We want men to help this feminist movement in order to get what we want, right? Why is this true that men will likely join? Two reasons: the realization of unfairness and inequality. Understand that when we paint these men as beneficiaries, this is when the moment when these men realize, oh shit, we have been benefiting too much, maybe it is unequal. This is when men will be more likely to help their women, right? But second, okay, sure.
Yeah, you just claimed before this that misogyny is internalized. Why are men going to suddenly come to those realizations?
Okay, I'll handle that. I'll continue. Second reason is that men are not being painted as villains. Understand, men are more likely to join because the system is built, when the narrative is that the system is built to benefit men, and that's how it is built. You can now be a part of the change because you know that this system is something that is corrupted. Impacts then three things: more buy-in for men, second, more policies in favor of women, and less discrimination as a whole. But even if you don't believe that, here are three independent reasons why status quo already adopts this narrative, which is already siding with women. Three reasons: the liberalization and progressive society. Understand, we already have an awareness of equality, and there is more programs, and men are leaning towards like being in favor of women. But second is that there are already more women in power structures already, looking like women in CEOs a little bit, and this helps the narrative, right? But third, female sympathy is increasing. This is when there is a rise of the feminist movement in status quo. The conclusion is that the status quo that use this in status quo, we already use this narrative, and we say that we want to stick with the status quo because they haven't proved us an urgency for this feminist movement to shift the status quo in the first place, right? The framing, which makes this argument very important, is that we make men see that they have benefiting from patriarchy for far too long, and they need to help women in order to gain equality. Why is this then exclusive on our side? Because we want men to support feminism, not support women while being in feminism. Why not, right? Three reasons why they can't work together inside feminism, because three reasons. One, feminism will lose its focus. Second, it will lose buy-in. And third, it will lose its principle as feminism. Again, this motion is fighting for feminism. If Akasyah can save it somehow, I have no idea. Second extension on buy-in among women. Understand that the frame is that women are afraid to join because there is no hope and men will not engage. several reasons why it's true that women will join is because there will be more hope to work together with male structures. There's less antagonization of these men, and that they're tired of men getting this benefit when we paint men as the beneficiaries. For all those reasons in opposition.
Thank you, your position by the government.
Have you resumed recording, please?
Yeah.
I'll take a PI as soon as IIUM. Okay. I think the biggest fundamental flaw in IIUM was when they argued that feminism should be exclusive, that feminism is purely about women. I think the reality of feminism is that two things. And it's weird because in the same breath, they tell you that feminism should be intersectional. And then now say it should be exclusionary because male hijacking happens. I think there are two fundamental flaws. Because firstly, UNC's already characterized of what feminism looks like. The principles of feminism was never anti-men. The principles of feminism was pro-women. These are two different lines of logic. But thirdly, it was fighting against the patriarchy. Is patriarchy a name of a person? Insofar as patriarchy exists as structure, we think the fight and the biggest villain has always been the structure. So you can't argue that the individuals within those structure are your challenges. I'll talk about Bernie Sanders thing later. But the third thing here that's problematic within IIUM's speech was the idea that there is a change that can happen, or like there's an insulation that can happen, because men somehow are all Apple CEOs, and men somehow all own Ferraris and can cry in their Ferraris, and it's fine, we don't care. Then the problem here is that people are multifaceted and different. This means sure, some misogynistic men, which they can identify symmetrically in our world, we think we can identify misogynistic men and people who are clearly beneficiaries of this patriarchy, meaning that obviously those are problematic individuals. We're talking about targeting a structure here. We think the people within those structures are people who benefit of the structures, right? But thirdly, I think it's about talking also about this logical case for that they have, which is the idea that their stance was that it's about acknowledging that men are beneficiaries. But the question then becomes, what is your pathway to deconstructing patriarchy, like what Atifa tells you? Because they tell you that the objective is about deconstructing patriarchy without showing you the pathway towards that. Just say, let's acknowledge that men are beneficiaries. So the correct case line in which they should argue is the villainization of men. That's how you get men to opt out. It's crazy I'm using that case at this point. But it's about getting men to opt out of the structures by villainizing them and telling you that you need to exit for the structures. It's something that didn't happen. If they haven't proven as to why they reached solvency, I don't think their argumentation can still stand beyond multiple different analyses. So simple questions we need to then answer on Gulf, sorry, to immediately win this debate. So number one, what is this debate about, right? Because very clearly, this debate is about the change in narrative, the change in the portrayal of men. So this looks like the usage of vocabulary in which we target men for strategic reasons. Two strategic reasons. Number one, it's about getting buy-in from individuals outside of the feminist structure, so people who don't necessarily believe in the feminist structure. But two, to get buy-in from those very individuals in the patriarchy. So you need men to opt out for the patriarchy or not believe in the patriarchy anymore for you to challenge those structures, because that's what emboldens the structure, right? Back to it again, it's the structure that's the problem. But thirdly, it's also about women within your movement and how they interact with men surrounding that. The only way in which you can unite individuals is oftentimes against a common enemy. Notice here that their common enemy still looks like men. Notice here that insofar as their case line looks like antagonizing men still, or at least even acknowledgement, I think it's super soft, but still an isolation that happens, a social isolation happens, a large chunk of Ernsi, PM, by the way, speech is still left standing, that the polarization is extremely problematic. Because notice the impact of polarization, which was very apparent. Because the idea of affirmation, structures of affirmation is uniquely important, because we tell you that the structures of affirmation that exist within God's world is simple. That the patriarchy is something that is problematic. You are a direct victim of patriarchy. That the reason why you feel like you take your own life is because of the patriarchy. So is it something that necessarily benefits you? If you feel like your existence is shit, if you constantly have to go through work day by day to provide for a family which you no longer love, right? To provide for a family that no longer love, but because it's like prescribed to you and you can't escape all those things, it is necessarily something that is beneficial. You're crazy to argue that men don't suffer as well. Because the large chunk of male suicide, like the large chunk of suicide, are still men. So there is still some level of problem that males face when it comes to the patriarchy. But what's the tangible impact of this argumentation? It's simple. It's the reality that in order for you to persuade individuals to fight against a structure that's problematic, you need to firstly change their minds. Firstly, make them believe that the structure doesn't benefit them, that they're a victim. And when you are a victim, you opt out of the structures. But secondly, and here's leading back into the polarization argument to understand, right? Which is that the structures of affirmation that exist on their side, unfortunately, by result of no alternatives, are people like Andrew T. Are people who affirm the patriarchy and say, you should stop crying, grind set, bro, hustle, bro, because that's what you should do as a man. This is the structures of affirmation that they have, and they proudly defend in this debate because they tell you, who cares about men crying? Who cares about all these individuals? So on their world, this polarization means you create more misogynistic men. You create more men who don't want to interact with the feminist movement by virtue of the feminist movement being completely polarizing, by virtue of the feminist movement being exclusive and in opposition to men. Go.
We told you that your harm is mitigated when you use your male capital to mitigate all of your capital. Why is this so much more less important than the convoluted pathway you have pointing at it?
Here's the problem. You first need to realize that the problem is the patriarchy. So the vocabulary that you need to use is important. You can first call out, you need to clearly characterize that the problem is not your existence as a guy. It is the system that screws you over. It's not because you have a penis that fucks you over. It's because the system chooses to fuck you over and tells you that because you have a penis, you have to work hard. This is the principle that they clearly feel because they constantly think it's about the fact that male capital can protect you. Sure, but it's a huge narrative. How much contention can you go against that? Secondly, how many people can access this crazy and building response to their one? But lastly, then, what is the true comparative of this debate? We eventually proves government, like on the most clearest ballot ever, wins. Because two things. Number one, the true comparative is the vocabulary use. That means that even if both a lot of things are symmetric when it comes to the patriarchy, oppression, etc., it's about the strategy in which the feminist movement will use to achieve solvency. Because this is a debate about the feminist movement. So we need to talk about how we achieve change and deconstruct the patriarchy. I think at the very least, Gulf is the only team to provide multiple layers of analysis of how you do that. But secondly, to prove to you the harm of the current situation, or like what they say is the current situation regarding patriarchy, right? Regarding feminism as a whole. So if we prove solvency, I'm still waiting for WIP finally to bring solvency.
Wesley is right. There are obviously two men there are the misogynists, and there are in fact victims. But I think there's an important thing to note about the victims. Three things. Number one is they are in fact greatly privileged comparative to the women who are in fact suffering. This does look like capital as well as opportunity. Secondly, that I think they just greatly exaggerate the harms which men are in fact facing, particularly from these patriarchal structures. But thirdly, just I think the ability for them to opt out of these particular harms is easier at the very point in which you do have this particular capital. I think these are all mechanisms and mitigations which make their harm just marginally more, like, less important in this particular thing. Ultimately, our case is not hung on all men being bad. Our case is hung on all the bad men, all the bad men do in fact help some of the victims and trickle down effects there. And that's why we should villainize both of them. Let's talk about three things. Number one, on alignment. Number two, on the creation of structures. And number three, on the deconstruction. That's just mechanism as well. But let's start with like the creation of structures, because this is the most like historically back, right, on the timeline. Ernst asserted to you that men had absolutely zero involvement in the creation of the patriarchy. To that, what did Atifa respond, to which we had no responses to them? Four mechanistic examples. Number one, just the existence of the Ottoman Empire, as well as other religious authorities such as the Crusades. Number two, just colonialism being headed by men in general. Like, we all only know about James Brooke, we never heard about his wife. But more importantly, just like the existence of presidents and all of these structures which are male in general. What does this mean? Leadership roles, historically speaking, have been male-centric. And what does that mean? Their ability to, and their capacity to entrench capital, to create systems which prefer men, and more importantly, to cultivate a culture which celebrates men, are all things which are reasons why men had in fact made this particular choice. And that the patriarchy is inherently a choice which men had made. I think that's something that they just failed to assert, to like prove, right? What does this mean? Number one, this creates a principal obligation to then deconstruct and recognize that men are in fact the problem, something they just never engaged on. But secondly, it becomes a core part of the patriarchal value to have men as beneficiaries. And I think that's what we've been pushing since early on. Only on our side of the world can you access two things. Number one, the ability to call out these men who are in fact benefiting, the point at which you don't just like be apologists for them. But number two, and therefrom be able to deconstruct these particular things. What does this look like on their side? Likely there will be two priorities from the feminist community. Number one, to point and to try ascertain who these elite misogynists are. But number two, to save men. And that's a very hard thing to do. I don't think, number one, you can discern between the elites as well as the normal victims. But number two, be able to not only point at them, but also try to save them at the same time. This is an extremely convoluted process, which we've told you from early on, which is a very reason why you shouldn't be using this as a means to achieve some capacity of change. There was never a single burden proven on their side why this is, number one, not convoluted, but why even if it was convoluted, this process can still be attained. I think that's why on their side of the world, the ability to point to a particular goal becomes far more harder. We're willing to say, men are going to cry. We're going to point at them anyway. They can just go to therapy. And they have the access to. Now, my second paper, okay. Let's just talk about alignment. Even if it is true that women fight for equality, sure, I think that's a reasonable claim. Why they haven't fulfilled that burden? Ernst generally told you that feminism is about equality, and therefore they aren't just anti-men, they're more about 50-50. And yeah, sure, we agree. But the degree to which you buy their benefit ultimately is hung on the amount of equality which already exists in status quo. Insofar as status quo sees even a 60% benefit to men and a 40% benefit to women, shifting discourse will only make it far more easier for men and patriarchal structures to continue to then undermine their problems and to continue to say we should advocate for men and should have additional structures which then help these men within these particular societies. What this looks like is really simply, I'm probably a crying man because of toxic masculinity. There are 3 women who don't have access to any capital to get any therapy, but because on my side of the world, they celebrate me and they say I should be someone who's safe, instead of focusing on the 3 women who don't even have a house and don't have access to therapy, they're going to create structures like quotas for men to access therapy. I think that's the world that they've been trying to push. I think that's why on their side of the world, the point in which you do in fact get a more discourse on their side without the prerequisite of equality, there's just no equality. Yeah, Wesley.
You can't prove zero sum. You can't say zero sum without proving zero sum. If both can happen, you can see men and women. Why is it zero sum?
Wait, what? You can clarify that. Like, I just don't get it. Why? I don't think you. Anyway, so that's why. And what did we say? I think we said relatively clear, which is just status quo, right? Which is there is simply no equality which exists right now. For all the reasons which I've told you, historically speaking, these structures exist, which is why women have been locked out of having access to good opportunity. But more importantly, just on their side of the world, when this becomes a predominant narrative, the ability to reinforce these structures and to create new structures and to undermine structures which are inherently female become far more easier. That's why on their side of the world, even if women are inherently equal, they cannot talk about it yet because there is no equality yet. And therefore, we have to push that they are in fact villains. That's what happens on their side of the world. Let's just talk about mechanism, and this is just how we'll finish the debate. But you can PY one more if you really want to. Government wants to push deconstruction through pointing at two things, right? Number one, the men which are in fact misogynist and elite, but also save men and somehow mitigate their problems. I think our trade-off is relatively clear. They do save some of these men on the bottom. How important that is and whether there are other things which can help them, I'm uncertain. I'm sorry, we already told you, there are other things which can help them, which is just why their framing just isn't that important. They also never really told you why, so much so, engaging with Atifa, the identity isn't traded off, the point in which you are in fact an apologist. What's our mechanism very clearly? That status quo is in fact sufficient. That the normalization of feminism has in fact been done in 2024. More importantly, that there is in fact a growing left. Therefore, even if we don't co-opt all of the men, there are already a lot of men on our side of the world. I think the trade-offs and weighing are really clear. We get things relatively slow, and that's fine because, again, it's happening. Number two is we get to keep our identity principally. More importantly, is there's a clear goal. In as so far as there are those three women who we don't know about and don't have access to structures and will continue to not, on their side of the world, we win.
Every time I've been gaslit harder than I fought Malaya. IIU is not able to misconstrue the entire NC's speech and get away with calling those responses. You know, to respond to a case, engage with the structural things that we've talked about, not just strawman the case. I feel like I'm living in Sungai Petani again with the amount of strawman that exists, right? Couple of meta callouts before some things coming from them and issues, right? First, I'm unclear as to why this debate is suddenly zero-sum at the point in which deputy comes up with speech. Insofar as the feminist movement already fights for intersectional ability, they have not made clear why the very presence of men simply hijacks the movement and shifts capital away to such direction. Because number two, another meta comment here, they have a very weird framing of what the feminist movement really looks like, which doesn't weigh in enough. If they claim the feminist movement is meant to be exclusive and meant to be something that's only for females, but then in the same breath argue that they have male allies that are willing to opt into the movement and that's how they get change, then they're unable to properly characterize as to how this movement looks like. We've been very clear from the beginning that male opt-in and buy-in is a method in order for political change, in order for actual roadmaps to get. This waving around because it's the only thing that proves to you an actual pathway to solve it. Insofar as they don't do that, they have a hung principle that they never prove and weird lines in order to attempt to prove where they get solvency. Number two, they want to claim that all men are just generally successful and they can cry in their Ferraris and go to therapy. This is untrue. We think the elites probably do that. We are fine calling them out. A vast majority of men don't. Number three, let's talk about this weird uncharitable notion of misogyny, right? They claim that misogyny is going to hijack the narrative of why we allow men on our side, but then they can call it out. I think it needs to be fair. If misogynists are so apparent, then we can call out either side of the house. The bulk majority of men aren't misogynists. Like, I don't think I'm a misogynist, which means that most likely men can opt in and can be seen to be as a part of the movement. So I'm unclear as to why then using the narrative, using the language, that all men that are bad is something that is important. Number three, I don't know why they have a soft pathway to change because their only mechanism is acknowledgement. Given the fact that sovereignty is still a very big part in the round they refuse to engage with, that means the mechanisms of who ways in the round is able to shift windows and push for change. And all they tell is hijacking, even though I don't understand how this happens, but their comparative is an acknowledgement that somehow guilt trips the very men they don't want into the movement to solve them. I'm unclear as to where the roadmap in order for specific change occurs under the side of opposition. three things that's just hung on their speech. Number one, I'm unclear as to why men and women can't work together. The fact that they exist in a lot of industries together. Somehow, when it comes to the feminist movement, if we are proven to you from NC that we are fighting the same structures, they can't work together. This is an unproven premise. Number two, I'm unclear how they get men buy-in on their side. If their entire thing is to guilt trip the men and then say that they don't want them anyways, I'm unclear where the pathway to solvency exists on the side of opposition. And number third, why solvency? Which means at the end of opposition speech, all I have is a bunch of assertions as to how they get the most important mention in the debate, which is tell you about change and how to push men to buy it. But they have a principle that they also haven't fully proven, which means on the principle clash about protection and better discourse, we win the debate. Three issues. Number one, about structures as a problem. In the lines of Boss, what is this debate about, right? If structures is an inherent problem within this, and we can call out structures absent of the men that are not complicit in creating them, but have been forced in order to keep it going, I'm unclear as to why this isn't something that's beneficial. We've proven to you that opt-out is a countervailing force, and in absence of this, at the point of pushing, you get worse forms of affirmation. It means you create more harifs, you create buy-in into Andrew Tate, buy-in towards worse kinds of TikToks and pushes in order for men to self-affirm. That means weighing here, solvency means that more men are likely to become demonized and more men are likely to buy in to the worst forms of the patriarchy on your side of the house, which is only a side in which we challenge structures and we better able to change this perception and get more buy-in to the movement. But we proved to you three things under the next issue about solvency for change: how we get better buy-in, how we reduce polarization, and we increase more political will. The lack of engagement means we weigh better because it's just a clearer roadmap on outside the house, how we get tangible issues in order to push feminist movement forward and get the changes that you require. Finally, on protection, we're going to do how we protect women from the most harmful forms of male discourse when males are backed into a corner and forced to lash out. But we also protect individuals that do matter, that women do care about individuals, about equality. You're not anti-men, you're pro-women. Stop misconstruing the feminist movement, stop misconstruing Gov. We take the battle.